I've had the opportunity to attend a series of seminars presented by NASW on racial equity, and I would like to share some of the information and materials that some of those presenters gave us during the course of that seminar. Now, I want to acknowledge from the beginning, as a white, middle-class, cisgendered male, my perspective on this topic is perhaps more intellectual than based in my own experiences in life. I recognize the privilege that I have been given in my life throughout my life, in fact, and also want to tell you, though, that I am still working to understand and acknowledge the amount of privilege that I have. And so just keep that in mind as I talk about these materials. I'm sure that many of you share the same spot in your life as I, and others do not. But it is from this perch, so to speak, that I share this information with you. The materials that I am working with, for the most part, or for a large part at least, come from two presentations in that series of seminars. One was a presentation by Vivian Jackson and Karen Bullock, social workers, entitled Cultural Competence and Racial Justice, Working to Undo Racism. And another presentation by social worker Leticia Villarreal Sosa entitled Racial Equity Through a Clinical Lens. Cultural competence is a term that we have been throwing around in the social work profession for a number of years, and recently it's to be noted that there is a question of whether cultural competence is really what we need to be striving for, or even if it's achievable. How do we become competent in other cultures when we haven't been raised in it as well? Because there are so many nuances in our clients' cultures. For the purposes of this discussion, NASW identified cultural competence as the process by which individuals and systems respond respectfully and effectively to people of all cultures, language, classes, races, ethnic backgrounds, religions, and other diversity factors in a manner that recognizes, affirms, and values the worth of individuals, families, and communities, and preserves and protects the dignity of each. NASW has established standards and indicators for cultural competence in social work practice in 10 different areas. And this pamphlet is available through the NASW website if you want to have a copy of it for yourself. The first standard, ethics and values, what I've done here is really highlight some of the primary essence of each standard. You can review these for yourself, but in the area of ethics and values, we are expected to have self-awareness, cultural humility, and the commitment to understand and embrace culture as central to effective practice. In the area of self-awareness, social workers must also be aware of their own privilege and power, and must acknowledge the impact of this privilege and power in their work with and on behalf of clients. In cross-cultural knowledge, social workers should possess and continue to develop specialized knowledge and understanding that is inclusive of, but not limited to, the history, traditions, values, family systems, and artistic expressions such as race and ethnicity, immigration and refugee status, tribal groups, religion and spirituality, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, social class, and mental or physical abilities of various cultural groups. And I should amend that because I said we should possess, and actually the standard says we shall possess. For cross-cultural skills, we should demonstrate an understanding of and respect for the importance of culture in practice, policy, and research. And in service delivery, we shall be cognizant of and work to address service gaps affecting specific cultural groups. The sixth standard is empowerment and advocacy, and it states that social workers shall be aware of the impact of social systems, policies, practices, and programs of multicultural client populations, advocating for, with, and on behalf of multicultural clients. The diverse workforce standard indicates that social workers shall support and advocate to ensure diversity within the profession. Professional education says that social workers should embrace cultural competence as a focus of lifelong learning. And in language and communication, we shall provide and advocate for effective communication with clients of all cultural groups, and not only those with limited English proficiency, but also those who have disabilities such as blindness or low vision, difficulty with hearing, and such. And finally, Standard 10, leadership to advance cultural competence, indicates that we shall be change agents and demonstrate the leadership skills to work effectively with multicultural groups and agencies, organizational settings, and communities. There's a lot of things to think about there and to review for our own purposes as we look at our own practice, tendencies, and skills. Race is in our discussion a lot, most recently in particular, and here's a number of different terms that are bandied about and that you are becoming familiar with, I believe, if you haven't been before. And if not, and you're not sure what some of these terms refer to, I encourage you to look them up and talk about them in class, in fact, if you have questions about them. So what is race? This is a sort of one of those Sociology 101 conversations that I often offer in my lectures. And this is viewed as a biological characteristic and has been historically seen that way, so that any one of the groups that humans are divided into based on physical traits regarded as common among people of shared ancestry has been at least considered to be race. And it's often associated with ascribed status in a society. That means essentially that if you have a biological characteristic that you're born with, your skin color, your facial features, whatever it might be, that ascribes you to a certain status within society that either is full of privilege or full of oppression. We've come to understand more recently that race really is a social construct. When you look at the various cultures around the world, race is defined very differently, and even within our own culture at times, one's race is identified differently. When we understand that race is a social construct, we see that the categorization of people with an identity that is assigned by rules made by society rather than biological characteristics, and are often based on physical similarities within the groups. This social construct symbolizes assigned status within a society that is less subscribed and more assigned, meaning that it's something that might be changed. Race as a social construct tends to function as a gatekeeper for opportunity, and it certainly influences our interactions with others. The census is an interesting feature to look at when you consider what race means and what race is. And as we look at the evolution of identification of race in the United States Census from the first one in 1790 to our latest count in 2020, these definitions evolve quite a bit. The category names often change in reflection of the politics of the time based on science sometimes and public attitudes. Colored became black, Negro and African Americans being added later, and in this last census the term Negro was dropped from the census data altogether. Through 1950, census takers were the ones who determined the race of the people they counted. Since that time, Americans choose their own race in the census process. And beginning in the year 2000, Americans could include themselves in more than one racial category. So for the first time, multiracial people were counted in one racial category. Back in 1790, there were only 4 categories: free white males, free white females, all other free persons, and slaves. But in 2020, there were, I believe, 19, almost 20 categories to differentiate among individuals, racially speaking. When we think of racism, oftentimes we think of it as being personal or institutional. And in fact, I like these definitions because they split this up into more nuanced kinds of definitions of racism. So really, there are 4 different types here. Internalized racism involves privately held beliefs, whether they're conscious or unconscious, those implicit biases that we often carry. These are privately held beliefs and acceptance of the racial hierarchy. This acceptance of the hierarchy can include internalized superiority, or it can also include internalized inferiority, where the individual in the minority population accepts the limitations, say, that's placed upon their group by the larger society as being reality. Interpersonal racism is the acting upon racialized beliefs of inferiority and superiority in our interactions with others, and this includes such things as acting on bias, bigotry, hatred, racialized speech, acts of discrimination, and so on. Institutional racism involves the inequities based on race and institutions and systems of power that create different outcomes for persons based on their race. And we've seen plenty of examples of this in our society recently through the legal system, law enforcement actions, admissions in universities, hiring practices, and so on. These institutions most likely will not identify race as a factor in choices made and decisions made, but the outcomes demonstrate that race is clearly a factor. And all you're going to need to do is look at some statistics in any of these areas, and you can see the marked disparities between how persons of the white majority culture are treated versus those of minority cultures of all types. Finally, systemic or structural racism, which is kind of a breakoff from what we think of as institutional racism, implies a racial bias across the institutions of society. And this involves the dynamics being normalized that result in the advantage for white persons and the cumulative adverse outcomes for persons of color. So this takes institutional racism essentially and spreads it across all of society and over time as well. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about in more recent times of uprooting and changing in our relationships. There are different kinds of trauma that also is involved in racial experiences, and the suppression creates and maintains systems that perpetuate suffering and create trauma. Racial trauma is unique in that it involves ongoing individual and collective injuries arising from constant exposure to race-based stress. I heard a speaker say recently that a person of color oftentimes must be afraid whenever they step out the door of their home. But more recently, they have to be afraid being in their own homes and on their work site and in the classroom, everywhere they go. And they talk about the stress that this creates as they're aware of the fact that they are viewed differently and oftentimes are subject to various acts of discrimination and violence because of their racial group. This creates a trauma that has a lot of similarities to post-traumatic stress, but still is very distinct from it. Leticia Sosa referred to historical trauma as soul wounds, which result from cumulative psychological wounds arising from historic traumatic experience that have intergenerational effects. Colonization, genocide, slavery, dislocation, mass violence against certain groups all have had their impact on the various racial minorities within our nation and our society. And if you're doubtful of this being a reality, I encourage you to review the concept of epigenetics. There's some very interesting videos available through YouTube if you want to go a more casual route rather than looking it up scientifically, that explain this very clearly and how these events actually alter our brains as we experience them and can be passed down from generation to generation. Historical trauma is something that needs to be addressed on a community level, that individual work here is insufficient in this. There's also a book by Rizma Menachem called My Grandmother's Hands that has been recently published. It's a book about racialized trauma and how to go about mending hearts and bodies related to it, and has been highly recommended. This author believes that trauma work needs to be contextualized within a reality of white supremacy and how this lives in the bodies of both people of color and white people as somatic neurobiological responses and long-term health issues. Again, this relates back to the concept of epigenetics. To be effective in our work, we have to challenge ourselves to do our own work about trauma awareness and racial justice. There are many issues regarding racial justice that are prevalent in today's society, include the outcome disparities among COVID-19 patients, Black Lives Matter movement and the responses of society and institutions and individuals as well, and frankly the backlash among white supremacists and arch-conservative individuals to this movement, a lot of active misinterpretation of what Black Lives Matter is all about, and oftentimes blaming them for things in demonstrations that go awry when there's no indication that the movement itself has anything to do with that. Of course, with law enforcement and its abuse of power in dealing with racial minorities, particularly young African American males, immigration and how it's being handled, voter suppression tactics, which are very prevalent around the nation, and also the process of gerrymandering, which, again, if you're not familiar with this, I encourage you to become familiar with it, which goes about the redistricting, drawing new lines based on census statistics that create districts that are safe for white candidates. And this is a very intentional action on the part of individuals involved in gerrymandering and redistricting of voting districts after each census. And it's something that needs to be challenged. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court recently declined to be involved in state decisions about voter redistricting, and so the states are free to create their own districts as they wish. That has created some problems, particularly in certain areas of the country like the South. We have a number of different ways that we can begin to respond, and just among a few of them is we need to work to review and adapt a curriculum in our own social work education programs around the nation, a decolonizing effort. Decolonizing means removing the European standards that are central to curricula in universities and really all schools around the nation. And there are many different features to this, but this is one active effort that needs to be accomplished if we're going to become more inclusive as a society with minority groups. We need to address the impact of racism and other forms of oppression upon our clients and the communities in which they live, and acknowledge the existence of racism and confront it where it's found. It's startling to me to hear individuals say that there is no such thing as racism anymore, that differences in color and race don't matter in our society any longer, when it's so obvious that they are there and that they do exist. We need to stand up to those assertions and correct the thinking of those individuals. And finally, identify steps that we need to do individually, interpersonally, institutionally, and structurally. That's a big response, but there are many different things involved in that. But this is just a partial list. Social workers should be leading efforts to implement specific strategies to change in their own practices, the institutions in which they work, and policies and practice within society as a whole that ensures equity for all persons. We are, in fact, the only profession that requires an understanding of structural racism and to develop competencies to address race and racism among its members. So we have an obligation there because of that particular feature. But we have roots in social casework that can go into a long description of the history of how we got to that as a profession. But our roots in social casework really kind of leans on the medical model and is seen by some as contrary to the mission of our profession. It tends to be social casework. It tends to be needs-based, not rights-based. It tends to pathologize clients through the use of the medical model, where we identify a problem the person has that needs to be fixed. Despite the fact that we tell ourselves that we utilize strengths-based approaches, this social casework model utilizes an approach that is really deficits-based, where the worker has greater power and can determine what it is that the client needs and identify what is wrong with the client or for the client. This social casework also uses an approach that reduces the power of the client in that event and doesn't really work to empower them. Again, another feature of our practice that we claim to have, which is a belief in empowerment and the need to do so. So in our direct practice in particular, we need to be very careful about these questions as we go about our work with individuals. Clinical practice really doesn't have to just focus upon psychological interventions. It can combine psychological interventions of direct practice with socio-political interventions, and I want to talk about that a little bit here. Here's a good example of an area that needs addressed. Now, it's particularly if we're working in a mental health field, and many of you will be, or even not directly in the mental health field, but working with clients who are in mental health services. There are many access to mental health services for our clients. Again, focusing more upon those low-income minority clients who live in areas that don't have a lot of services immediately around them, but really applying to most all of our clients. For one thing, this is a survey I think that was conducted in Chicago a few years ago, and you see that the cost of mental health services was one of the first things, the biggest thing that was identified as preventing individuals from accessing mental health services. Lack of health insurance, which of course is a huge issue in our culture over the last several years. Not knowing where to go. The lack of outreach to minority populations and low-income populations is very evident in this. Sometimes services aren't even there at all. And so you conclude in here, lack of transportation, lack of affordable transportation availability to get there. Lack of childcare is another area, affordable childcare. Lack of services being offered in the preferred language. So you can see, go on and on here. These are all areas where, as we work with individuals in direct practice, we can also be addressing these on a mezzo and micro level and advocate for change in these areas so that mental health services, among other services, this is just one example, that mental health services become more accessible to our clients. The connection between social work and social justice is found in a lot of the theories in social work that belong in both fields, and that is empowerment of clients, restorative justice, the constructive narrative theories, practices that we find now. and also advocacy and advocating for our clients. Now, these are just some of those areas, and you can probably identify other unifying theories as well that exist in both clinical work and social justice. Many of the theoretical perspectives in direct social work practice really offer a connection between the psychological and socio-political environment and give us some ways in our direct work to engage in anti-racist work, even if we're in a one-to-one traditional therapy kind of relationship with the client. We need to focus upon and utilize the client's strengths, resources, and the contexts in which they exist. We should learn about the client experiences in race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, abilities, as these are the things that shape the client's worlds and the meanings in that world. These are things that sometimes we don't really discuss with clients in our work, and we need to get over our avoidance of these topics, I believe, and allow our clients to share their stories in these areas. We need to analyze our own professional and educational organizations, how power is distributed in those, and work to increase the client's power, the individual's power in these organizations. This includes agencies with which we work, or for whom we work. Many of the critical social work and postmodern theories and therapeutic approaches can be utilized in clinical work to assist the client in addressing oppression in their world in the context of the direct clinical work itself. You don't have to set it aside. These are some things that in the proper setting and at the right time and with the clients who are in need of, you can address in your individual work. C.R. Swenson wrote an article called Clinical Social Work's Contribution to a Social Justice Perspective a couple of decades ago, and it's a very interesting article. And in that article, it suggested that clinical social work allows us to understand clients in the context of strengths, social positions, and power relationships that exist in their lives. It encourages us to develop techniques to enable clients to understand themselves in these relationships and to be liberated when these relationships are oppressive. If you remember thinking about internalized inferiority, we talked about it, different forms of racism. This is one example of this, to help clients recognize if indeed they seem to be exhibiting evidence of that, to help them recognize that and to overcome those oppressive belief systems that may have been installed in them over the years and years of oppression. We, of course, need to engage in self-reflection about our own personal experiences, our own privilege, and our tendency to dominate others and how we do that. With people in our lives who are privileged and powerful, to work with them some to help them understand their own privilege and power and encourage their motivation to change related to their roles in clients' lives. And finally, to work with our agencies to develop new structures to counter oppressive beliefs and the practices that arise from them. So again, things we can do, acknowledging our own biases and working to overcome them, fostering awareness of these issues within ourselves, sharing that awareness with others so that they might begin their own journeys in terms of understanding their biases, build our own knowledge, take some risks in our conversations, have those difficult conversations with others, become activists, allies, and partners. There's an interesting comment made by one of the presenters saying that she didn't really like the term ally because that term implies that the other person has a problem and we want to help them with it, that we'll stand with them and work with them, but that really it is their problem. And when we talk about it in terms of being a partner, we're acknowledging that this is a problem for us too. Now, the problem may be that we have privilege and we're abusing that privilege or we use that privilege, but that's a problem if we're going to advance racial equity, racial justice in our society. So it isn't just a problem related to individuals and minority populations and those who are oppressed. It's a problem for all of our society, and we need to view it that way. For as long as that exists in our society is never going to find peace. We can plan and implement for internal change and organize for social change and challenge those things in our society and the structures of institutions when there's a need for that. And these actions can take place on all three of our intervention levels. And even in clinical practice, we should place our focus not only upon the client in the micro level, but also look for ways to advocate on the mezzo and macro levels as well. And here are some suggestions at each of these levels. And these are just some of the things that we can do in those levels. There are many more as well. Interestingly, in the mezzo level, where it talks about policy review and revisions, this does suggest a very careful look at the agency's policies for which you work and to begin to address any areas that are not equitable, that further oppression of minority populations, and to begin to challenge the existence of those in policies and practices. That can set you at odds sometimes with your management, but it's something that needs to be done. This is a graphic that I thought was very, very useful that Leticia Sosa presented to us about becoming anti-racist. And racist ideas really suggest that a racial hierarchy is in existence, whereas anti-racist approaches suggest racial equality. And you can see here that becoming an anti-racist is a gradual process. It's a growth process, and the different zones and the kinds of attitudes we might have as we move towards becoming an anti-racist as an individual. Take a moment to look at that. What does cultural humility involve on the individual level? And here are some questions we can ask ourselves to advance our own cultural humility in terms of self-reflection and in terms of addressing power imbalances. Self-reflection really involves looking at our own cultural identities and also how those identities shape our worldview. I noticed sometimes among middle-class individuals, white persons that I've worked with, that they identify themselves as American and they have very little understanding, very little knowledge, surprisingly, of their own heritage as where their family has come from. So unless an individual is a Native American, the individual comes from immigrants. And where did those immigrants come from and at what time and what was the experience of those individuals coming into the United States? Because if you think about it, again, in terms of epigenetics, those experiences have something to do with shaping our own attitudes about society and others and the world. It's very important that we research our family histories if we don't know them and find out as much as we can about them, because it will tell us something about where we're starting from. Many of us, most of us perhaps, who are doing this research are coming from places of privilege. And how that privilege gets established and how we own that privilege is something that is a part of us in our fabric as well. This is a part of why sometimes knowing our background can help, but also our background can hinder our connection to clients in their communities because of some assumptions perhaps that we might have based upon the background, based upon our deep family history, so to speak. So it's very, very worthwhile to investigate this background, and I encourage you to do that. Talk to elders in your family, not only for those in privileged status, but also those who have grown up in suppressed status as well. Talk to elders and find out about their experience, how that affected them and impacted them, and how that might affect subsequent generations in the family. How do I value input from my clients and make space in my practice for clients to name their own identities? And what do I learn about myself when I listen to others that are different from me? As far as power imbalances go, what are the social and economic barriers that impact clients? What are the experiences that clients have that relate to oppression and systemic issues? And how does your practice actively counter and challenge power imbalances? And how can we extend our responsibility beyond the individual client and advocate for change on a larger level? These are all a part of the questioning process and the growth process in becoming culturally humble and anti-racist. This is a very interesting chart that one of the presenters gave us in regards to moving from a non-racist to an anti-racist stance in an organization. So this really looks at this process from a mezzo or even macro perspective rather than individual micro level of changing ourselves. And if you're working to alter your organization, your agency, here are some good characteristics of the non-racist and the anti-racist approaches that might help you distinguish between the two. I like in particular the fuel source indication here, where the non-racist is the intellectual and the anti-racist is spirit-based fuel source. And the speaker described that as being anti-racist coming from the heart, whereas the non-racist is coming from the head. Now, both groups may be very positively oriented and intend to do things right, but the anti-racist involves an active approach, whereas the non-racist tends to be passive. There's a desire not to be racist, But from an anti-racist perspective, that person is identifying and dismantling the aspects of the institution or the organization that they work for that tends to contribute to oppression. This is just a good way to kind of compare the two. I think both are well-meaning, but the anti-racist has this active approach, and that's the key in anti-racism, not wishing for change, but actually acting to change on an individual and a societal level. And in closing, just a couple of quotes here. Of course, you're become familiar with John Lewis. I remember John Lewis from newsreels during the Civil Rights Movement a long time ago, and he was a young college student actually at the time, and he got elected to Congress and has served in Congress and is a leader in civil rights and racial justice for decades. And of course, he died in 2020. And left a message not long before he died. The scene you see here is the man being beaten by police is young John Lewis during a march in 1965 across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. It was a march led by Dr. King, and he was very active in that march, was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And this quote about how we need to get in good trouble was made from the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 2020, not long before he died. And Martin Luther King said at one time, "I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never be a reality. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word." He was always very eloquent and inspirational in what he had to say. John Lewis's comment, "Ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is not the struggle of one judicial appointment or presidential term. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe even many lifetimes, and each one of us in every generation must do our part." I hope that you find these slides to be useful and thought-provoking, and let me know at any time if questions come up. Thank you.